part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hey, Producing While Asian listeners, welcome to the third week of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander History Month. We're here with Tony Award-winning Broadway producer Rob Laqui, who is also a friend of mine and is the next person in this series of Here Lies Love producers that we're chatting with to kind of highlight those who were part of the first Filipino producing team on Broadway. Rob currently works with No Guarantees production company and does many projects on his own as well, and is a staple in the Broadway producing community. So I'm really happy to have him, and I'm really excited for you to meet him and learn about his path from performer to producer and everything in between. And so let's get into our conversation. This is Producing While Asian. I'm Don Mike, and this is my conversation with Rob Laqui. Hello, Rob. Welcome to Producing While Asian. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Don Mike. Happy to be here virtually.
Here in the ether that is podcast world, but people will see you soon. But I'm glad you're here because we have a lot to talk about. It is Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander History Month. So I figured let's talk to members of the first Filipino producing team on Broadway and discuss all of those fun things. But before we get into that, I want our audience to meet you, Rob. And so tell the audience a little bit about who you are and how you got involved in the performing arts, and then kind of how that led you to becoming a producer.
Well, I am first gen Filipino, born and raised in Minnesota. My parents are from Quezon City in Manila in the Philippines. I've gone back every, few years or so. Still have family back there, but I went to school in Minnesota and then I came out to New York a million years ago to finish out school and then ended up booking gigs. I went to school for musical theater. I ended up actually more at first downtown. I was at La Mama for a while with their rep company, Great Jones Rep. And then from there, I ended up working with dance companies, and I was with dance companies for almost a decade, if not over a decade. The company I worked with was Momix as a dancer. And then from there, I got into puppetry. I was in the first national tour of Warhorse, and then I also puppeteered for Cirque du Soleil, the road with them. And then throughout this entire process, I was also sort of working like many artists do with different hats. I worked in development and fundraising for the National Theatre of Great Britain and their American office, which led to me working in their production office in New York, overseeing transfers of shows from the National to New York and to Broadway. And then I made a full-time jump from being a performing artist to producing in 2018. Since then, I've worked with, like I said, the National Theatre of Great Britain, their New York producing office, with Mara Isaacs and her production company, Octopus Theatricals. And I'm currently at No Guarantees, which is Christine Schwarzman, Darren Johnston, and Megan O'Keefe as EVPs and president, as an associate producer for them. My own personal producing credits, I work with a production company called Cardinal Theatricals with Andrew Rasmussen. And we have done co-producing on Here Lies Love. We also did merch for Here Lies Love. I helped with that and consulted on that. And produced on the producing team of A Strange Loop, which garnered the best musical Tony of its season. And I'm also co-pro on the Hadestown Tour and Hadestown West End currently. Phew.
Nice. So much.
Yeah, that took up our time. Okay, good night. Bye.
Okay, thanks. No, that was awesome because it's nice to hear the full scope of your background and in terms of work, because like I've heard parts of it, but not all of it. And so yeah, to our audience, like Rob is a Tony winner, so we've got a Tony Award winning producer on our podcast. So tell me a little bit more about like kind of making the decision to really slide over to the producing side and behind the table as opposed to performing anymore. I'm sure you obviously still have those skills, but kind of walk us through that process of like what made you kind of move over to the other side of the pool.
Well, like I said, I think being an artist, you wear a lot of hats. So I've always been really interested in how the entire product is made, like all the ingredients of the pie, really. And I don't know if that's a natural curiosity that every artist has, but it's one that I have. And also, I was really used to working in ensembles and building something from an ensemble, which I also sort of take into my producing practice as well. So as I was still performing, that's when, because of Warhorse, I ended up talking to the production side more and the producers of when they came out, and we would just, after the show be out and talking about what it takes to build the show, which sparked my interest in it. And I ended up working for the National before getting into development with them as a press rep and marketing rep on their press tour. The season after I was with Warhorse. So I was able to speak as a puppeteer, but also produce these press and marketing events. So that was the first time I was like, oh, there's this whole other aspect that I might actually have a skill set in, because I'd done sort of press work before and had, written copy for press events and such. But I was still performing, but I stayed in contact with all these people, which I think is a really important thing to note, that it was the same thing with my artistic life as a performer. I went after projects and reached out to people that I had done research about, that I was interested in, that they were either doing work that was resonant to me, or they were working on projects that I felt I had a skill set to offer them. So there's a couple of moments in my career where I definitely was like, oh, I did a cold reach. Like, I didn't know Warhorse is one of them. I literally emailed the puppet company and said, I saw Warhorse, I thought it was amazing, and in my heart kind of knew I could do that work. And they're the ones that forwarded my information on to the production in Lincoln Center, which got me that opportunity. Also, like, and that opportunity led to so many other things. So I think leading with that interest was like definitely helpful. And then, so I stayed in contact with people from the National, and I'd work with development for them, but they share a New York office to the development side and then the production side. And I had a good relationship with both. And still talking to the production side in my context over there, I was actually puppeteering with Cirque in Australia when I got a call from my friend who said that there might be both puppetry positions and or production positions available for Angels in America that was coming to Broadway, transferring from the National in London. And I decided at that point there was a re-up for the next year for Cirque, and they kind of tempted me back to New York. I said, you know what? I want to see where this road leads. And so I ended up coming back to New York, and in a weird way, starting over. I went back and worked with the development team again for a bit and also on the production of Angels. But then I ended up then becoming a full-time production employee a few months later for the National past that point. So, which sort of led to all these different things. I was of the firm belief that I could do everything if I wanted to, but I found as I dug deeper into sort of the producing route that I have done what I wanted to do as a performer. I don't feel like there's anything left unanswered in that capacity. If there's obviously opportunity where time allows it, my energy allows it, my skill set allows it, or whatever, I would consider it. I mean, some things have come up with puppetry, but the work I'm doing in the producing sector just feels a little bit more weighted for me to have to stay in this lane for a while. But I don't think there's ever a time when I'm like, I'm 100% this or I'm 100% that, right? If anything, even as an artist, I always kind of define myself as a facilitator of someone's artistic vision or someone's artistic work or a project's artistic vision or work. So try to maintain that course. So there wasn't necessarily a very like aha moment where I went, now I'm going to be a producer.
Mhm.
I still puppeteered like so the last few years I've been part of the puppeteer team for Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, Tiptoe the big blue reindeer. And it's the first inflatable puppet that the parade has ever used.
Hmm.
So it's like a hybrid balloon puppet. And I've been really fortunate to sort of be on this incredible team. It feels like a reunion every Thanksgiving.
Uh,
There's been a few of us that have done it the last 3 years in a row, so it's been pretty fun. So I'm like, this is my puppeteering for the year, guys.
right.
And I'm going to go back to the office.
Right. But I feel like that's kind of what producers do, right? Like we are the top of the every like all the different hats thing. Like, we happen to be in charge of the many different hats, but it's one of the hats that we wear, so like having other lives like puppeteering for you is like so natural because like producing just kind of happens. Like I feel like, you know, no one goes to school per se for producing. They just kind of are and it just just fall
Well, there
into it,
are
whether
more programs now. Yeah,
yeah,
there's
like
definitely
whether
more
it means
programs out there.
fundraising or whatever it may be. I mean, it's just now that programs are starting to come on board because, like, for the longest time, all I knew was Commercial Theater Institute, of which many of us are alumni of because it was one of the only ones for such a long time. But I'm glad that people like Rachel Sussman are doing things that are more accessible. Like they're kind of, I don't know how often they do it, but they're kind of producing workshops that they do online so people can access that.
Business of Broadway. Yeah.
Yeah, Business of Broadway. That's right. And so I think you already answered the question, but like on a scale of like 1 to 10 in terms of how much of a producer you are, if I had to guess, would you sit at like five, like kind of doing everything?
Actually, no. I mean, right
Or you,
now, I would say probably in the eight category because it's kind of what I'm leading with.
sure.
When I think of like where you are and what roles you sort of claim in any given moment, I sort of visualize like what my business card says, right? And what percentage of business cards you hand out if you hand out business cards. Like who does, but we have them. There's still a talking point. So, like, how many of them you hand out with that title on it? And like, there hasn't been any other title besides sort of creative producer or associate producer or producer that I haven't claimed in a while. So it's more in the producing bench in the last few years. Like it really is like I shot out of a cannon, really. Like in a strange way, when I started this in 2018 and when I came back to New York, the trajectory that I had set for myself was really exacerbated by circumstances outside of things I could control. So when I first joined the National NT America, my colleague who brought me in ended up going to Audible as a theatrical producer. And so I was, manning this ship alone in relatively new to the space. So I had to learn really quickly. And the fact that the National was so generous in terms of supporting me in that journey and like being kind of like a part of my education in that sphere, but also having them as an artistic home that, you know, I was so proud to support all of the work that was coming out of there was super helpful. And I couldn't have asked for sort of a better first sort of like gig out of the gate. And then working with Mara Isaacs at Octopus, this value-led producing isn't
Yeah.
something that I is taught as much. Of course, Mara, I think, still teaches, or she did teach, her producing practice at the university level. So I'm so grateful that there's students out there that are mirroring what she's doing. And so I think there's so many ways into these rooms and the trajectory that I took into this space, it feels really bespoke, but also like it couldn't have gone any other way. And it's really shaped how I want to continue building my own practice. And I can recognize, and like the pandemic hitting was a huge factor in sort of like the trajectory of how a lot of us continued into this space because all these conversations around representation and equity got like shot to the front of the line. And all of a sudden we're in these rooms where we're having conversations with like the major players in the space. And they're like, well, what do we do? Hey, and they're looking at us, and there's not a ton of producers of color at that level.
Right.
So you're already, put into a position where you're having to sort of represent and then also telling them like, well, I can't represent the entire like,
Right.
conversation here,
Right.
but here's, what our experience has sort of dictated thus far. And then, working with a co-founder of the Industry Standard Group, which is literally an organization that is looking at increased representation and diversity in commercial theater producing and investing. And the eight of us co-founders, we first started talking in 2020 when we were in the great traumatic pause of that year. And we're all producers of color in the commercial space. And we really hadn't really had deep conversations or had worked together in meaningful ways before that, which was telling in and of itself. And then our weekly discussions kind of formalized into forming this organization to really start building community and questioning how the model has served a certain group of people, but not others, and how we could potentially change that. And it's been really inspirational to work with these guys, these people in this organization. And we're still going strong. We're still doing it. We're still increasing that network and trying to build financial models that are more accessible to not just people of color, but just underrepresented communities in general in the space.
And you're all actively involved with different shows right now, on whether it's on Broadway or in the West End or wherever. So it's not like how how sometimes industry groups come up and it's people who like don't do it anymore and they're trying to make change, but they're not actively involved. Like what I love about TISG is that you're all in it. Like you're in it, you're actively involved and actively like fundraising and producing and all that to bring that valuable experience to the table. Because of, like for me, for example, when I came to your first event or your event at the Rainbow Room, it was nice to be in a room full of people that were all different levels. For me, who's like at the Broadway level, relatively new, to kind of hear what people are talking about, what kind of the standards are in terms of how to move forward. And especially when at that time we were in the throes of Here Lies Love kind of winding down at the Broadway run. And so, and knowing that the team that runs CISG is all people also at different levels, like not everybody is like at the top of the field. Some people are relatively younger in the group, which is awesome. So I'm excited to revisit TISG at a future episode for sure and see kind of what you guys have accomplished,
Yeah, we're
over
still going, still
especially.
happening.
Yeah, and so it's really exciting to know that that resource exists. So we'll definitely tag that in our posts when we have this on, so people can learn more about TISG too.
Welcome everyone to Podcast 616, the official podcast of Earth 616. I am your host, Damon Royster, and I am inviting you to listen and subscribe to this Marvel Cinematic Universe podcast. On Podcast 616, we gather some of today's greatest comedians, writers, and actors to dive deep into all things Marvel, like comic book history and lore, all the interconnected superhero storylines, and of course, who's hot and who's not in the MCU. Honestly, why aren't you listening right now? You have the power to listen to Podcast 616. And as we always say, with great power comes even greater responsibility. Listen and subscribe to Podcast 616 wherever you get your podcasts.
What's up, everyone? Chase Smith here, host of the Chase Smith Podcast, and my podcast reflects who I am. My hobbies, my interests, my passions, my curiosities, my careers, my questions, and my family. I'll spend time talking about all types of sports, movies, TV shows, trending news stories, and other cultural events, and even faith. This is who I am, and I hope I can get to know you as well. Join me on the Chase Smith Podcast, and let's have some thought-provoking conversations, only on the Press Play Podcast Network.
So in all of that time, you and I met because we were both co-producers for Here Lies Love. So what is your connection to the show and how you got involved, and kind of how far back does your history go with Here Lies Love?
I mean, yes. So, as a Filipino artist, Filipino American artist in the space, there's not a lot of shows that you can kind of point to and say, oh, this is reflective of my experience or a background, or I relate to this because I have a direct line to this story. And when Here Lies Love came out, a while ago, 2000, I don't know, 11, something like that. I don't know.
Yeah.
A while ago, over a decade at this point, I think, was the
Yeah.
first iteration for sure. I think everyone kind of knew that it existed, and it sounded, intriguing, and attaching artists like David Byrne and Alex Timbers and these artists that work in not necessarily the purest of commercial forms, but really have this vision and reach that isn't as, I mean, commercial in the sense of like, it's not a jukebox musical, right? It's not like,
Like all original work from a pop icon that people know.
yeah. Yeah. So when this was came about, like I think everyone that was Filipino as an artist was like, oh, especially the musical theater. I hadn't done a lot of musical theater, even though that was my degree, ironically. So I considered my sort of over of work a lot more sort of downtown or maybe artistically alternative to standard commercial theater. And I had actually met Alex Timbers years earlier. I lived up by Columbia, and my best friend from one of my best friends from Minnesota went to the Columbia playwriting grad program. And I believe Alex was going to direct one of her operas or directed one of her operas. So we kind of like met each other through, he didn't go to Columbia, but like this, like that generation all kind of like
Yeah.
knew each other. So I'd met him like years earlier, and I think I sort of kind of stayed in contact here and there. But like when I heard he was part of it, I had reached out to him and I was like, "Hey, I hear there's this Filipino musical going around. I'm Filipino. Hey."
Hey.
I was still on the road, like, but I was still like dancing and puppeteering and stuff. So I was like, you never know. I ended up going in for the show, auditioning, like Alex sort of like added me to the list of potential cast members, and I ended up auditioning for the show a few times. I think I was the last male swing in the last year I was at the public.
Hmm.
So I was in it for about 3, 4 months-ish before it closed. So, and I remember my friend who I was in Warhorse with, who's Vietnamese American. They had called me and I didn't realize I had booked it. I thought they were just calling me in for another callback because there was many callbacks. I didn't realize I had booked it until my friend from Warhorse called and was like, "Did you just get into Here Lies Love?" And I was like, "I don't know. Like what?" And because he was more plugged into the API musical theater community.
Okay.
I was in dance and puppetry, so no one knew who I was. So they're like,
Yeah.
"Who's this guy?" So I came in like, which is interesting, to think that I haven't done a lot of musical theater.
Hmm.
And even though that was my course of study and my major in school, and I feel really, really, really like privileged and lucky that one of the few things I did in the musical theater genre as a performer was to actually play my own culture and have a background and know this and be like, I grew up with this and my family went through this and like, so it wasn't lost on me, and that I came to it already having this other career and that I was, happy with, but then getting to do this was like this, what I call this really unexpected blessing to do this show. And even back then, after it closed, people were like, "Oh, is it going to transfer?" Blah blah blah. Like,
Yeah.
it did so well off Broadway that people responded so positively to it off Broadway that, of course, the conversation goes, "Well, what's going to happen to it?" So my producerial brain was like, "How would you do it? Like, there's no way you could do this and like change it to a proscenium. Like, it wouldn't be as magical. It wouldn't be the same thing." So even early days, I was kind of like, I don't know, like that seems not feasible. And then it played the National Theatre in London and it played Seattle Rep. So it had they were almost like tests for the future production. And then the producing hands sort of like shifted. And when the conversation was coming up, I kept hearing rumblings about I'd already
Mhm.
started sort of down this producing path. And I was kind of like, okay. And then early on, over a year before even its announcement, I don't remember, it was pretty early on in the process. The lead producing team, as it solidified for the production, they reached out to Miranda Go, Adam Hyman, and myself.
Mhm.
And because we were also known because of TISG,
Yeah.
and in our generation of producers, there weren't, now there is more,
Mhm.
there weren't as many Filipinos in the space. So they kind of like, they're like, well, we know these Filipinos. And then Clint Ramos and Jose Antonio Vargas had joined the lead producing team. So we were kind of the names that they knew. So we were brought in for early conversations about being involved with Here Lies Love in some capacity, right?
Yeah.
So I thought it was a really full circle moment. They were able to answer like a lot of my questions around the financing and like what it would mean and the visionary, what it would mean to sort of achieve this visionary goal of like making a space non-traditional in a traditional theater. And so I knew that there wasn't, in whatever capacity I was going to be involved in the Broadway production, from that conversation. I'm like, afterwards, I got off the phone, I talked to my family, and I was like, well, I have to do something, like,
Yeah. You have to be involved.
I have to be involved in some way. And there's not a lot of opportunities where the lead producing team is really actively seeking out people from the community that the show represents. So I was really, really happy that that was something that the lead producers were involved with and open to. And yeah, it just kind of evolved from there. And it's been such an incredible journey with how it has evolved. And, the fact that we got to sort of form this coalition of Filipino producers for this show, the largest group of Filipino producers on any show ever on Broadway, the largest gathering of Filipino artists across almost every department, on stage and off on Broadway ever. Like that is something that, as much as we would love the show to still be up on the boards, that's something that is a first, and something that can't be diminished by any of the challenges that sort of Broadway has now, right?
Yeah.
So it definitely feels really full circle, and it's also not over, right?
No,
I
it's
think
not.
that
Yeah.
How a project lives on, I didn't expect it to even do what it did in the last few years. So
Yeah.
I was already sort of consigned to being happy with my experience as being a performer in it. So now, having gotten to experience that aspect, seeing its evolution as a show, and seeing it on Broadway and being a part on the other side of helping it get to Broadway, is something that you don't necessarily get a lot in a career or a lifetime. And it's definitely something that I don't take for granted. And the lessons learned from like things that I would do different or things that I liked, I want to take into sort of my future projects,
Yeah.
including the network that we built, right? So
Yeah.
like Sige lives on, like, the
I-
fact that there's still a community that is having these events, that is formed from the community that built around Here Lies Love. Like that doesn't happen after shows close. That's very rare that something like that can happen. So the fact that it
Yeah.
still is happening now is pretty incredible.
I mean, it says a lot about like Filipino culture too. Like we like to hold on to people and not just say like, okay, thanks, bye. Like it's not a transactional culture. And I think it's, it's proof in the fact that we have an event like Seagate that's created by DJ Cherish Love, who is one of our co-producers, and that there's a monthly event that brings us all, where we have a place that we can go. And I think, making it clear to our audience that's listening that here, when a show closes on Broadway, that's not the end of the road. That like Here Lies Love does have a future, and it's actively being talked about. And so we're excited to see what happens next, and that we're all very much involved in the commitment of what happens to the show and where it goes. And so I too, like I love that we created this community of Filipino producers, because like if Here Lies Love didn't exist, I would probably meet like one or two of the group, whether it's through a show or if it was our other producer Jeremiah, would be probably through like needing a publicist for something, or all that. Like it's kind of like the origin story of like the Avengers, right? Like there was something that where we all needed to like come together, and so if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't all be connected to each other and now be here. So just really exciting.
Hello, Brooks here with the Books with Brooks monthly book club podcast. Listen, it is beyond time for you to join a book club. I know you've been thinking about it, and everyone's doing it. Here's how Books with Brooks works. We read one book a month, and then we talk about it. classics like Stephen King's The Shining, debut novels like We Are the Brennans by Tracy Lang, and tons of other compelling, life-changing stories, one book and 1 month at a time. So come read along with us and then listen in.
In your time so far with Here Lies Love, when you're a producer, kind of talk about I hate calling it like a rose and a thorn, but like what's like one really, and I know there are many, but like one really memorable positive thing that you got out of your experience in this chapter of the journey, and one thing that you feel like came as a unexpected challenge that you kind of learned and know how to tackle it for next time should something similar come up in a future production, or if it comes up again in this instance, so those
Yeah.
two, describe two of those.
Yeah, definitely. I think that obviously, like, just experiencing that kind of representation, I mean, even thinking about it now, like starts stirring like emotion because I don't think there was a single show that I wasn't sort of impacted. I mean, I went to see the show a lot. I think a lot of us did, but
Yeah.
I was there maybe at least once a week. I don't know. That's maybe I was there a lot. I saw the show a lot. I think it's the show I've seen the most on Broadway ever in my entire life.
Me
So
too.
that's saying something. But just the final tableau, the final song, also not only that, just seeing that, experiencing that actual like community that the cast sort of was emblematic of, right? And that they were also experiencing as Filipinos. Like you can tell that this meant something to them. There was a depth there. But then that connection with the Filipinos in the audience, right? Like, seeing so many Filipinos that you could tell that they just hadn't seen anything like this.
Yeah.
That, telling a really important story of our history and doing it in a way that is respectful, is artistic, beautiful, and really truthful. Like it was really, really impactful. And I don't think I'll ever really feel the same about a show again. I mean, every show is going to be its own different thing, but that was something that, I don't think I've bawled at a show as
Oh
hard
my
as I
gosh.
have. Like, opening was crazy. Like, I was just like, this was crazy. And it was just really, really touching and inspirational, really. I think the challenge, the flip of that is that when you do a show that is from a community that has history behind it, real history, it wasn't so surprising, but I was a little bit like, oh, taken aback at people within that community pushing back on the show. Art is subjective, man. Like I receive a thing in a different way than someone else does, and it's absolutely anyone's right to. But I also believe it's our right to tell the story the way that we want to tell the story, because we are also part of that community. And the thing that I thought was challenging was when people didn't want to have a conversation or a dialogue about it, where it was people within. It's hard enough to do a show that is, for brown people, with a lot of brown people involved in a predominantly white space. That's a challenge in of itself. So to have to sort of have the focus and do a lot of conversations, or not even conversations, but feeling like you have to defend yourself because you're not telling the story right, was definitely something that felt a lot more weighted than I had anticipated. Obviously, you expect some conversations around that to happen, but it is definitely this idea that I don't want to fight my community to advance my community. There shouldn't feel like there's a conflict there, but it is a nuanced conversation to have. I'm not saying that we're right, they're wrong, they're right, we're wrong. I think that we live in a time where we want things to be very binary and black and white, and it never is, especially when it comes to historical, figures, especially controversial historical figures. That what art does is actually stoke conversation and stoke dialogue so that, we had so many examples of people that Filipino families that came to the show that their older generations would then share with the younger generations their experience with this time in the world that they didn't even know about, that they didn't know was part of their own family history. And to me, the value of that supersedes 100% documentary accuracy. It's art, right?
Right. It's a
And
music.
it's a musical, and also the liberties that were taken were done with such care, right? There wasn't this, we did not ever purport to be a historical documentation of the historical facts of what happened, because we have whatever 100 minutes to tell a story that spans a long time. What we wanted to do was say, hey, this person existed, these people existed, and this was the response of a nation
Right.
to these people in that moment. And that response was inspirational. You
Totally.
know, that's the focus of the show. And I think people, and like that's something that when I was doing press wrapping and stuff, very similar. You're like, you know, the questions people are going to ask are always going to be the questions people ask. And obviously, the one that I answered the most, oddly, I mean, not oddly, obviously, to be honest, especially from people that weren't Filipino, and particularly from, majority, white potential audience members that hadn't seen the show, didn't know about it. They heard, Imelda Marcos, and they were like, where are the shoes? Shoes, 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 shoes. And to me, it was such an example of like distilling a moment, distilling a person, distilling an era to one singular thing that might represent a portion of this era, moment, and person, but is not by any means represent the whole picture. So, by the time I had answered that question a few times in my brain, I'm like, okay, I have my press quip when anytime anyone asks me about the shoes,
Yeah.
right?
So what
So
was
I'd
your
always say, you know what? People, especially in America, they know about the shoes. This is about everything you don't know about the situation.
yeah.
And the stuff that's actually more interesting.
Oh yeah. And when people ask me that question, I would be like, we mentioned the shoes once and having none of them. So go and find out more.
Right.
It's one
Yeah.
song. So it's there. The shoes are there. They're just, in mention. So
Yeah. And I
but
guess
I,
if
I
I were to say like one other challenge of the show is that when you do something new, especially in a space where the tendency is to try to, rely on what has worked in the past for other shows, we're not those other shows. Heroes Love wasn't those other shows. Like if I had my, time machine to go back, I'd suggest building a longer ramp, or like, all
Mhm.
these other things, and or really leaning on the agencies that work on the show to like think in a way that is bespoke to Here Lies Love versus, any other show that they're holding on Broadway, because it really isn't like any other show on Broadway.
Mhm.
So to treat it as such felt, like it maybe didn't do as much as it could have, right?
Right. Because it was a new show, but it was like new in the sense that like everything about it was new. We weren't just like putting a new show in a space that already existed, right? Like we were doing like a new show, even a newer version of itself, but then like recreating the space, recreating the tech that goes with it, like recreating the idea of what a producing team looks like and what a safe space for this cast looks like, in this environment, and even all the way up to like marketing and finances and all that stuff. It was all new. So I think I agree with you in the sense that like we did something important and special. Whether everybody understands that is a different story, but
Right.
we've definitely
But we're
opened up.
always welcome to have that conversation
Right.
around it too.
Exactly.
Like I don't want to be, I think our tendency when we meet someone that or hear something that is so adamantly counter to what we feel is to have the same amount of sort of defensiveness or passion, but in the other direction, which I think is totally valid. But in terms of actually opening up the conversation, it's not necessarily as generative. or fruitful in a way to advancing change on either side, right? Others just like yelling at each other and who cares?
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I think that is also reflective to some degree in my producing practice where I love an Avengers model. Like it's funny you mentioned that because I sometimes use that to describe TISG as well. And I'm always inspired by the strengths and skill sets of people around me that have different backgrounds, and those different backgrounds, fostered and cultivated their skill sets, and their strengths. And that in a way that could never have been mine. But it also clarifies where I sit in this room and what I bring to the table and the value and agency that I contain within a group. And I love sort of when it feels like you can be inspired by the people around you while
Mhm.
at the same time being additive to the entire picture.
I
That's what my favorite thing is. Like I
yeah,
never want to be the sole voice on the top of a mountain deciding a thing. That's
right.
not really attractive to me.
Totally. And I think it also illustrated for us that we can do more as a community, that we can reach farther than we've done, that we thought we could only do. Like I love what DJ Cherish said when we closed. She said, we've only reached the top of a mountain. We haven't reached the end. Like, we reached the top of this part, but there's other stuff to be done. And I think with all of us coming together and the inspirational part, it's like now we're inspired to actually, not that we weren't before this, but like more of a reason to attack the dreams and projects that we want to do that either represent our community or not, because like we now know that we can exist in that space, that we can exist in those conversations and those rooms. And I think it's so important because that's precisely why this podcast was founded, to talk
Yeah.
about people like us that exist, that can be in the room, that do have the capacity to be at the same level as the communities that have been in charge for so long, and to blow it up and make space, and take the seat that we can have at the table. And so, given that experience with Here Lies Love and those things that you're informed about, which thank you for sharing those things. It was really, really great to hear that. Where are you going next? Like what are your current projects? What are kind of things down the road that you can share already that aren't still top secret? What's coming down the
That's
road?
the issue. That's always the
Yeah, what
issue.
are the
Like
things that are
until ink is on
currently,
paper, there's always like a little,
right?
a
Or
vagueness
maybe,
around things I can
or
talk
maybe we
about.
can maybe we can like rephrase that. It's like what do you think is the most interesting project that you can publicly talk about that's coming next at this moment?
I'm with no guarantees. So there's a whole slate of things with no guarantees that I'm working on, which I'm super excited about, projects and initiatives that I think are really going to be interesting additions to the space and our industry. So there's those. That's that box. Doop.
That's
Um, on my own, like I said, I'm co-pro on Hadestown Tour and the West End. So that's, may it live forever, may it tour forever. I'm seeing it while I'm in London, which is I'm excited about because I want to see sort of how it translates. And I've seen that show probably the second most I've seen of any show. So I'm excited to see that. I am looking at producing some or helping do workshops for some early development readings, which I'm excited about. Artists that I've worked with for years that I have really been a part of their journey. I was EP on a web series that is now being potentially shopped and developed by Showtime. And so it's that artist group and that's still on the books. And then I'm also an EP executive producer for, and we're heading into a writer's room too, which should be interesting, for a TV show that we've been pitching for a few years now. And it still gets traction, so we're always evolving it. I think that if anyone's getting into producing, the thing that is the most telling that I like to say is that some things the turnaround's so quick, and some things
Yeah.
you're like 2 decades later, you're like, we're opening, or here's this thing. Like the every project takes the time that it needs to take, right?
Mhm.
And your impatience or your drive to either make that happen or delay it is you can control to some extent, but sometimes it's just when a thing has to happen. Like, and again, like to reference Here Lies Love, like of course we wanted that to run for years and years and years. And sometimes the show happens when it happens, and
Mhm.
it serves the purpose it serves when it serves it, right? And again, it doesn't mean that that project can't evolve into more generative states.
Mhm.
So similarly, we're still in pitch mode for shows that I've sort of been attached to for a bit. And, I'm really interested in other forms. When I worked for the National, I was doing a lot of work for their immersive storytelling studio, which focuses on alternative sort of storytelling modes in AR, VR, XR, immersive, that kind of thing. And I'm still hyper interested in how storytelling in theater relates to those other mediums. So I'm always sort of like looking and seeing where I can like lend my support and skill sets in those areas as well.
Gotcha.
But yeah, nothing super specific. Again,
Yeah.
pen on paper is when I get really
Yeah.
like, okay, now I can talk about this.
I mean, it was like that was such a good answer. You were like able to describe things you're doing, but not actually saying the specific of what it
Should I be
is.
a
So,
politician? Shoot,
like, I feel like
I did
you
it.
career in answering but not answering, if that makes sense. But I
Yeah,
get it.
yeah.
I get it. There's a lot of confidentiality that happens in this field, and you don't want to burst the bubble before people sign a contract. And I get it. So, where can people find you? Should they're like, I love Rob Laqui. I'm now a
I
Rob Laqui.
mean, just Google my name. I'm the first thing that comes up. Like, there's not a lot of other Rob keys in this space. My name is relatively unique, I think. It's not super common. Most Lakeys that I know of are relatives.
Right? You're like, I know
I
them.
don't think I've found one that hasn't been. But yeah, you can find me on the internet very easily. My socials are, you can variations of my name. So for someone that was doing press and marketing, I'm terrible at social media for my own personal means because I'm usually when I moved into producing, like I was so much more active in those
Yeah,
capacities because as an artist, you're the brand. And
right.
then as the producer, you're like, wait, I'm not the brand. So like that engagement for myself dropped off very, very, very easily because it takes work to do that. So
Right.
like, but yeah, you can find me on social media. You can find me on in the old internet pretty
The
easily.
old internet. Well,
Yeah. Ye
well,
old internet.
thank you so much for taking the time. Are there any parting words you'd like to give to any budding producers who may be listening or people who want to?
Yeah, like I would say like similarly to what myself and others have done, people working in this space, we have information that's so easily accessible, right? So literally, if you Google producers of color, you will find resources. You will find the industry standard group. You will find the group Theater Producers of Color, which Miranda Go founded, which, and the Business of Broadway ladies that are doing, you can actually take classes in commercial theater producing that exist. And alternately, there are programs now. There's a Columbia program. I think NYU has one. I think Pace has some classes. Like they're actually teaching a little bit more of what creative producing or intentional values-led producing looks like at that university level. So don't be afraid to go out and look. Don't be afraid to go out and reach. Like the worst that can happen is you get a response saying, never talk to me again, which I've never gotten.
Rarely, rarely, yeah.
If anything,
Well,
you'll
my
just
Facebook.
not get a response and you'll be like, cool, move on to the next.
Mhm.
And I will also say there's a world where I've done that a few times and then maybe the response has been lukewarm and then I've worked with someone that has worked with that person that I can use that as a leverage point to reach back out, which has then generated an opportunity.
Mhm.
So I think as particularly artists of color and producers of color in this space, we're so used to pounding the pavement. We're so used to like going after it that our determination really dictates that the reach is to me one of the biggest things. And I'm always happy to have conversations with people. Like I'm relatively still young in this space, so I'm still learning and building my own practice and my own network. And I'm always happy to sort of like open that up to people because ultimately, like you said, we're just trying to find our space at the table, but we also don't want to close the door behind us, right?
Yeah. True.
That we're doing this work so that future generations of people from our communities and other communities get to tell their stories and get to participate in something that we haven't. And there's a lot of power in that. So,
And on that
yeah.
note, thank you. So hopefully we'll have
Thank
you back
you.
soon. I'd love to talk more with you in the future once those other projects come online. And well, I will see you
Yeah.
when I see
At
you.
the next events. Come on,
Next
Here Lies
event.
Love.
Right? All righty. Well, take
Yeah.
care, Rob. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Don Mike. Bye.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Producing While Asian podcast. Our theme song was created by Luckstock. We're produced by Press Play Podcasts, and the show is edited by Michael Santos Sandoval. If you have a moment, please leave a rating and a review, and send any ideas you have to producingwhileasian@gmail.com. To follow us, stay updated, or to read our blog, visit www.producingwhileasian.com.